Good morning to our participants in the US and good afternoon to our participants in Europe. A very warm welcome to the third and last online session of our KAS AICGS Transatlantic Trade Week, where our transatlantic trade relations headed, China, the WTO, and climate change. This online series over the course of 3 days is jointly hosted by the German Konrad Adenauer Stiftung, or Konrad Adenauer Foundation in English, and the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. My name is Paul Linnertz. I'm head of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung office to the US in Washington, DC. Our first session on Monday with Peter Bayer, Wendy Cutler, and Christoph Szemionek was about engagement versus enforcement. How can the United States and Germany manage China's impact on the global economy? Yesterday, we were dealing with reforming the World Trade Organization. Can the United States and the European Union find common ground? For this, we were happy to welcome Dr. Sabine Weyand, Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, and Professor Gabriel Felbermayr. Also an incredibly interesting discussion. And today, during the next, let's say, 60 minutes, we will focus on reconciling trade policy and climate goals. As mentioned in the invitation, this event will examine 3 key issues. One, the prospects for climate-friendly progress in the WTO, such as the Environmental Goods Agreement, and subsidies rules that discourage fossil fuel use and promote renewable energy. Secondly, we will discuss about the resilience of supply chains and the potential for transatlantic cooperation to promote sustainability within them. Finally, the event will look at how a joint U.S. EU approach to a carbon border adjustment mechanism could take shape and potentially be expanded to other like-minded countries. Again, I'm honored and happy to welcome an incredible lineup of panelists. I would like to warmly welcome Jamila Thompson, Senior Advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative, for the opening remarks. Thank you so much for being with us today. For the discussion, she will be joined by Dr. Susanne Dröge, Senior Fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, SWP. William Reinsch, Scholl Chair in International Business with the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, here in Washington, D.C. And last but not least, Professor Simon Evenet at the University of the beautiful St. Gallen in Switzerland. Thank you all so much as well. It's a real pleasure. Just a few final remarks, if I may, dear ladies and gentlemen, before we get started. During the course of, let's say, the last 1.5 years, we all got used to these digital or virtual conferences or meetings, and they all look so easy because you don't see a lot of staff running around in the conference room to make sure everything works. It is less obvious what is happening behind the scenes. In this case, for our Transatlantic Trade Week online series, we have started to exchange thoughts and ideas basically since January or February, since Peter Rashish wrote a paper for us titled The Trade Agenda for the 46th US President. And I'm especially proud and happy that we decided to devote today's session to the nexus between trade and climate policy, an aspect which has not been very high on the agenda yet, at least from my point of view. It wasn't my idea. Instead, I would again like to express my sincere gratitude to Jeff Raske, President of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies, Peter Rashish, Senior Fellow and Director of the Geoeconomics Program at AICGS, and the whole team of AICGS, plus on our end, if I may, my colleague Janine Lairo for making this event possible. Peter Rashish will also lead us through today's discussion, and I'm very much looking forward to it. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Paul. Let me offer a welcome on behalf of AICGS to all of you. I also want to reinforce how important I think our topic is today. It's the topic that's beginning to get much more attention on both sides of the Atlantic, and I also detect some increasing optimism that by working together, countries that have an ambitious agenda can help trade policies and climate goals to reinforce each other rather than work at cross purposes. And I think that it's a perfect area for the US and Germany and the US and Europe to work together on, which goes in the direction of putting forward their shared values, which is also something that's really become at the forefront today. With that, let me offer a brief bio sketches of our speakers today. Our opening remarks, as Paul mentioned, will be delivered by Jamila Thompson, who's Senior Advisor to the U.S. Trade Representative. She previously served as Chief of Staff to Georgia's 5th Congressional District and Deputy Chief of Staff for U.S. Representative John Lewis. She, in addition to managing and developing the office's policy, human operations, she was directly responsible for several issues, including appropriations, budget, trade, tax, foreign affairs, human, civil, and voting rights, and other areas. Before she joined Congressman Lewis's office, she worked as a legislative assistant for Representative Barbara Lee of California. She's also served on the Mayor's Advisory Commission on Caribbean Affairs in my hometown, Washington, D.C., and is a senior fellow with the Stennis Center for Public Service Leadership. She studied at Goucher College and also at the University of London's School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS. Dr. Susanne Dröge is a senior fellow at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, also known as SWP, where she has served as head of the Global Issues Division from 2009 to 2015 before becoming a senior fellow. She's also worked at the German Institute for Economic Research, sometimes called DIW Berlin. And in her current role at SWP, she focuses on U.S. EU, Chinese, and other climate policy strategies, the UNFCCC negotiations, energy-intensive industries, carbon leakage, and trade policy implications of these issues. She's also advises the German Parliament, the German government, and international organizations on climate and energy issues. She has attended the Free University of Berlin and the Kiel Institute for the World Economy in the field of advanced studies and international economic policy research. Bill Reinsch, who will be joining us in just a couple of minutes, holds the Scholl Chair in International Business at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. He spent 2 decades on Capitol Hill, mostly working for the late Senator John Hines and then Senator John Rockefeller. During the Clinton administration, he was Undersecretary for Export Administration in the Department of Commerce. And from 2001 to 2016, he was a member of the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission, as well as serving as president of the National Foreign Trade Council. In addition to his role at CIS, he is also senior advisor at Kelly, Dry & Warren and teaches at the University of Maryland School of Public Policy. He has a BA and an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. So Bill, when you're here, welcome back to Hopkins today. And Professor Simon Evan is a professor of international trade and economic development at the University of St. Gallen in Switzerland. He has served twice as a World Bank official. He's been a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, as well as a member of the UK Competition Commission. He's taught at Oxford, at the University of Michigan, and at Rutgers University. And he's also been a visiting professor at Hopkins twice, and as well as at the University of Michigan on several occasions. He's the founder of the Global Trade Alert Initiative, which may be known to many of you for its work since the global financial crisis. He received his PhD from Yale and a BA from University of Cambridge, both in economics. Before I hand the floor over to Jamila Thompson, just a few housekeeping remarks. She will speak for approximately 10 minutes, after which she will need to leave us owing to other commitments. Then I will ask the panelists for their comments, and then we'll have a round of discussion among the three of them. After that, I'll open up to your questions. And if you'd like to ask a question, please use the Q&A tab on your screen. For members of the media here today, we're on the record and we'll also be recording the event and posting it to our website. So with that, I'm pleased to hand the floor to Jamila Thompson.
Good morning. I hope that my VPN system works well and that there's not too much of a delay and that you can hear me with no problem. I want to thank you, Peter, for the very warm welcome and the invitation to join today's discussion on reconciling trade policy and climate goals. It is an honor to be with you this morning, and it is an honor to join this esteemed panel, these esteemed panelists. For many of you who are joining the discussion today, it is no surprise that this conversation and this issue is a priority for the Biden-Harris administration and the United States Trade Representative, Ambassador Catherine Tai. Soon after taking office in January, President Biden signed a sweeping executive order to tackle the climate crisis at home and abroad. The executive order established a U.S. government-wide roadmap that places the climate crisis at the center of foreign policy and national security, and establishes a government-wide approach to tackle the climate crisis. As we strive to recover and to build back both better and more resilient from a devastating pandemic, as we strive to and place workers in the center of trade policy, as we learn from the lessons of history to build a more equitable and inclusive economy, as we restore our relationships and our partnerships with our global neighbors, and as we endeavor to preserve this precious planet, the only one we have, for future generations. It is impossible to ignore the trade policy, and the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative lies at the intersection of this critical foreign policy, national security, and economic policy challenge. I want to pause here to underscore a point. You may notice that I refer to a crisis when addressing the gravity of the situation and the work ahead. We must be both clear and consistent about both our language and our mission. In the same manner in which we need to address the rules and the incentives that encourage a race to the bottom when it comes to suppressing workers' rights, depleting the Earth's resources, or exacerbating the reality of underserved communities, we need sustained complementary solutions that apply an intersectional and inclusive lens to addressing the alarming reality of the climate crisis. This is the reason that Ambassador Tai's very first public speech focused on the connection between trade policy, the environment, and the climate reality. Her message was clear. Gone are the days when trade tools were not considered legitimate and necessary in helping to address the climate crisis. The ambassador wanted the country and our trading partners to be on notice that USTR is here and reporting for duty in supporting the whole of government efforts to raise climate ambition and mitigate the catastrophic impact of climate change. Collective solutions will require collective actions. And like the threat and devastating impact of the climate crisis, that strategy extends beyond borders. I would like to provide a few brief examples of opportunities to advance these principles towards meaningful action with our trading partners. As you know, there is considerable activity and attention towards meaningful outcomes for the 12th World Trade Organization Ministerial Conference that begins at the end of November. As members prepare, it is important that any messaging that emerges from NC12 reflects mutual supportiveness of trade and environmental policies. Members can work within existing trade rules to address pressing trade and environmental issues, which include transitioning to a net zero economy and achieving the Paris Agreement goals on or before 2050. Trade can facilitate a race to the top and create opportunities for sustainable development through strong, enforceable obligations for environmental protections, while providing for expanded economic opportunities for workers. If we find the rules need to be updated in the pursuit of meaningful, and I underscore meaningful, outcomes at the WTO, we remain open to considering such changes. A key to crafting a worker-centered trade policy is also partnering with our allies and friends to address common global challenges. This is the reason why Ambassador Tai continues to strengthen relationships and to build upon the progress of resetting the U.S. EU engagement in the large civil aircraft industry by engaging with her colleagues, including meeting last week with German Federal Minister for Economics and Energy, Peter Altmaier. As you all know quite well, the US and the EU announced the new Trade and Technology Council at the European Summit a few weeks ago. We hope that it will create a strong venue for promoting cooperation across the Atlantic on key climate-related issues, including, for example, clean technology. Finally, the Biden-Harris administration is doing its work and critical work to support a global transition to lower emissions economies in pursuit of achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. A critical component of that work is to confront the climate crisis by building supply chain resilience with a focus on broad-based growth and sustainability. Meeting U.S. decarbonization aims will involve a massive domestic build-out of clean energy technology, and we cannot afford to be agnostic regarding where these technologies are manufactured and where the associated supply chains and inputs originate and from where they originate. Innovations that are essential to a clean energy future require an ecosystem of innovation, skills, and production facilities that, quite frankly, the United States currently lacks. That is why the American Jobs Plan is so important. It is a once-in-a-generation capital investment to create millions of good-paying jobs, rebuild our country's infrastructure, and position the U.S. to compete globally in key industries, including clean energy technologies. As the United States tackles these issues, we must work with our allies and partners like the EU to secure supplies of critical goods that we will not make in sufficient quantities at home. And as we strengthen our collective supply chain resilience, we must also ensure that high standards for labor and environmental practices are upheld. The severity of the challenges to stay connected and engaged during this global pandemic only underscore why regular collaboration, consultation, and communication are critical to ensuring that our approaches are complementary and do not create new barriers to trade and the good, livable wage, clean jobs of an equitable, greener, and prosperous future. We must explore how trade tools can support advancing the desired climate and environmental benefits while minimizing interruptions to our important relationships, including and especially regular communication and collaboration with allies like the European Union. I would just like to close with this note. The path is clear, our work is cut out for us, and time is of the essence. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to join and provide some preliminary thoughts and remarks, and I hope that the discussion is fruitful, beneficial, and informative. Thank you.
Jamila Thompson, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for that expression of that strong commitment that we see coming out of USTR and out of the Biden administration on making this agenda we're discussing each other work. So again, thanks. We look forward to our continued cooperation with you and your colleagues at USTR, and have a good morning and afternoon. So with that, I hope you all had a chance to think about that, and I just wanted to offer all of you an opportunity to react to anything that Jamila Thompson said, and then we could have a bit of more of a discussion among us. Anyone have any initial thoughts prompted by her remarks? Bill, please.
Yeah, I do. Thanks, Peter, for including me in this. I guess my reaction was we've heard all this before, and we're still waiting for it to be translated into concrete actions or proposals. It's fine to say that we're going to have agreements that address these issues more aggressively, and that we want to have trade agreements that take into account environmental commitments and have an enforceable means of enforcing those commitments. I think that's all good news, but the reality is that we're not having any negotiations. They haven't announced any negotiations. They can't even decide whether they want to continue the negotiations that President Trump started. And there was someone who didn't care about the environment. There's opportunities there with Kenya and the UK, yet they've avoided saying anything with respect to their intentions on that. One of the larger pieces of low-hanging fruit, it's not entirely low-hanging fruit, but one of the things that's looming out there is the environmental goods agreement, which Trump ignored for 4 years, and the Biden administration has not said a word about it, and has passed up opportunities to say a word about it. So I think the intentions are great, and I've heard Ms. Thompson's speech in the past from others. But I don't see any actions being developed to actually implement the things that she's talking about.
Susanna or Simon, from a European perspective, do you hear it any differently?
Well, I wouldn't go as far as Bill does in terms of well, this is about managing the expectations and keeping up the message that the US is back. I also see a strong gap between this announcement and the actual talking and walking the talk. Still, I feel we need to be a bit more patient, because this is a real tour de force that the US administration is undertaking at the moment. Also, I feel that I realize how many extra narratives are put in place, new ones. That is, narratives like labor, in particular forced labor, which is moving the whole discussion in connect with the climate debate in foreign relations into the direction of anti-China policy making. And I wonder whether we will get back to that in our discussion. When it comes to substance, I agree with Bill. We are waiting for some concrete proposals here, and the EU, I feel, is somewhat really ready to wait for the US to come forward. And at the moment, there's a big relief that the signaling goes in a totally different direction, while the action is still missing.
Simon?
I would add, what concerns me about this whole discussion is how climate change measures could become a source of fragmentation within the global economy, rather and whether certain principles which have served us well in Geneva at the WTO and alike will be essentially subordinated. Now, I don't want to set this up as a big clash. We have had many good examples in the past of how non-trade objectives can be reconciled with the trading system. Look at the SPS and TBT agreements. As better examples, look at Article 20 as for some of the worst practice examples. So this can be done, but it has to be done very carefully and with a lot of attention to external considerations if you're going to avoid antagonizing trading partners. Now, in the case of the US, we have very little, which has been articulated in terms of details. That point has been made. In the case of the EU, we have more details on the table, but not necessarily much reassurance that the fragmentation won't ultimately result from their implementation. So we've got a long way to go on this. And I think the other piece I would put on the table as initial building block is that there's not much trust in the rest of the world towards either Europe or the United States on these issues. We have real problems in Geneva, concluding even an agreement on banning illegal subsidies in fish. So let alone talking about constructing a subsidy regime for a first order global challenge related to a transition to a low carbon economy. So I think, I'm much heartened compared to last year. So there is a step forward, but we have a lot of work to do, I think, in order to bring everyone on board on this issue.
Well, you mentioned the WTO. I wonder where the three of you think the best place to start is. And Bill, you mentioned negotiations. Is something like reviving the environmental goods agreement a place to start? Is looking at what you said, Bill, is kind of having strong environmental chapters in more kind of traditional bilateral free trade agreements. You mentioned Kenya and the UK. Maybe there are other fora. Where do you think the US the Biden administration should start when it looks to Europe and it says, okay, Europe, here's what we should do together, but where should they do it?
Well, I think in the extreme short run, the most important thing is the fisheries agreement. Which is an environmental agreement. It's not exactly entirely climate mitigation, but it's closest to the finish line. And it's been sitting out there for decades, actually. The fish are very unhappy. And we have a golden opportunity, I think, I think what's turning out to be strong leadership from Ngozi to try to get that done. So I put that at the top of the list. I think the EGA is ripe. It crashed and burned in the end of 2016, and Trump had no interest in renewing it, sort of sat there. But I think, the US was not the instrument of its destruction. And I think, therefore, we have a little bit as opposed to some other areas, I think we have some credibility, I hope, is a little bit more of an honest broker to try to restart that one. I wouldn't say that that's the biggest thing on the agenda, but it's also something that's relatively close to the finish line. And with the, we could do a whole conference on the WTO. In fact, we have done whole conferences on the WTO and its problems. But I think the generally agreed upon prescription is, they need to have some wins in order to reestablish credibility. And those are the two that are closest to doing that. The bigger issues, which I won't go into now, we can talk about them later, I think you want to, where the trade and environment intersect most obviously are subsidies and border adjustment measures. But those are farther down the road, I think.
Simon or Susanna?
Yeah, well,
What?
I think Bill is right. I mean, with the fisheries subsidies agreement, which has been under discussion for the last 10 years, that would be a super strong signal because it's being prepared. I mean, everybody knows the subject by heart now, and I think the strong signal would be to give something before you ask for other things, before you take. So the EU and US could really try to get together on this and push for it. While all the other things that are being ventilated are tricky, that's a matter of trust. So the two big parties coming to Geneva and trying to push for particular issues is at the moment difficult to sell, especially to developing countries. Still, I think that subsidies is a key word because we have a long-standing debate on the asymmetry when it comes to the dealing with subsidies. We do have suggestions to have a green box for renewable subsidies. While we have a strong case, we have enough cases on in which green subsidies are subject to claims being made for unfair whatever protection and promotion. And I think on the EGA, let's think twice. I mean, the EGA is very difficult. We have imprecise definition of what constitutes an environmental good. We have a positive list where you see things popping up where you think, what's green about this or this product, right? And then I think it's all about tariff reductions. Are we really talking about substantial tariffs here, or isn't it rather with the climate debate that we're talking about non-tariff barriers? And don't we have to think about how to find consensus on what non-tariff barriers could be useful? You mentioned TBT and SBT. I mean, this is already there. This takes a longer discussion, and I wonder whether we will have the time for it. But EGA, I'm really reluctant to get a déjà vu on what we've witnessed until 2016. I wonder how you all see this. I am in doubt that this won't be a waste of energy at this moment in this year.
So maybe I can add to this. I think we're prisoner to the timetable for the rest of this year, but that doesn't mean we should give up on hope on doing collaborative work on climate change, as I'll argue. We have a July 15th ministerial on fisheries, on the fishery subsidies issue, which expectations are already being downplayed on. So this is not going to provide the win which I think so many of us would like to see. There's a question here about whether this was the right issue to go out with first, as for the new Director General. Going to prime ministers and presidents and trying to get them to mobilize action on fish is something which is going to seem rather counterintuitive in the middle of a pandemic, which is why I'm expecting after the 15th of July a pivot towards trade and health as being a possible theme, which I think would resonate more in national capitals. That may take us up to the 12th ministerial conference, and maybe we can do something there. EGA I don't think is ripe for that either. Now, in the interim then, if we know that really the rest of the year is pretty much set in terms of bandwidth for negotiators, then in Geneva, then I suspect the right way to take forward the trade and climate change issue is if the US and the EU can start talking about specifics and coming to some levels of understanding about what a joint initiative could look like. Again, that might be useful sort of setting us up for 2023, and probably first for a very technocratic, non-Geneva based process first to widen the circle, or first agree on some common ground and then widen the circle with other countries. But this is a process which is not going to happen overnight. But I do, as I said, even though we're a prisoner to the timetable in 2021, that doesn't stop useful work being done to set up for a conversation in 2022.
What about environmental services? Would that be a way to generate a stronger dynamic among certain like-minded countries? Would that make more economic sense for those like-minded countries, including, say, the United States and the EU? Would that be a more effective path forward? What do you think?
Well, no. Good idea. I mean, in light of what Simon just said, I don't see that making it easier. I mean, I would be all for doing that, including it in the EGA or dealing with it as a separate environmental services agreement, whatever. I just don't, it might get a couple countries on board that may not be there now, but I don't see it as making things simpler. I don't know. Simon, you're more a student of what's going on in Geneva. Maybe you have a different view.
No, I don't. I see the logic of trying to include it. As you say, I think there would be some countries who would find this very interesting, but this is not going to move the needle on this file this year, I think.
Can I go back to something else that Simon said?
Sure.
I'd like to ask him about this. You were suggesting to pivot toward health, which I think is kind of a trade in health, which I thought was kind of an interesting idea. But my reaction to that was all that does is get us into the vaccine waiver issue. Is that really where you want to go? And is that likely to be an issue that's easier to resolve than fish? And is the EU view on that evolving?
So I think, if I may come back to that, if we do pivot towards trade and health, and I think it is probably almost inevitable, the vaccine waiver issue will come up. Then we will have to start asking for the people who want to have this waiver for much more concrete text on what's going on. I agree, people are very far apart there. I must say there's a widespread view when I was in Geneva last week that the US's intervention on this issue was unhelpful, but still it has happened and it is what it is. So then the question is there going to be stuff which can be done on trade and health, which people still see as valuable and good, which skirts around the vaccine waiver issue. And of course, I know that this will resonate very strongly with some NGOs. I think the other thing which I want to say on vaccines is that we are seeing a remarkable production ramp up at the moment. And so I would never go so far as to say this is a problem that's going to solve itself this year. But I think if the forecast for increased vaccine production or anything on the ballpark, we will have lots and lots and lots of surplus vaccines by Q3 of this year. And the discussion will be about countries which are hoarding vaccines, not about the waiver. So I think that I'm expecting the debate to shift quite sharply in that direction, and that might actually put some countries which hoard lots of vaccines on the defensive. And Bill might quite rightly say, well, that doesn't make it easier either. Yeah, fair enough.
Yes, I would say that, but I'd also say that there's a Machiavellian view about the U.S. position on this. I would not disagree with you when you said it was unhelpful. I'm sure the Europeans felt it was unhelpful because it put them in an awkward position, which may have also been part of the purpose. But I think that there is the Machiavellian view that the negotiation over the waiver will take so long that by the time agreement is reached, it will be irrelevant for exactly the reasons you described.
Well, when you talk about vaccines, I mean, that is in a way part of a bigger debate about supply chains and, supply chain resilience. How do you ensure supply chain resilience? And of course, climate is part of that. So it's so are human rights, and I think this idea of how you how do you kind of square the circle of wanting to promote economic efficiency, but also being concerned about advancing certain values, right? And I think that on climate, that is right front and center for the Biden administration, but I think frankly also for Germany and the EU when you look at some recent laws or some laws that are on that are pending. So if we sort of admit that there's a lot of there's a strong political dynamic on both sides of the Atlantic to get a better hold of supply chains, to try to understand where there are threats, environmental threats. What is the best way to do that in a cooperative fashion? How practically can the U.S. and Germany, or the U.S. and the EU work together on those sort of shared goal that we want to have supply chains that are climate friendly? Is there a ready-made way to do that? Should they come up with a new way? Is the new Trade and Technology Council, is that sort of lend itself to that kind of effort?
Well, I think if I may come in, sure. I mean, if there's a Green Deal on the European end, and if there is a long list of executive orders and standards being set in the US, this comes up automatically, because you don't want to have trade diversion after all, so that you will ensure that the bilateral trade flows will not be impacted in a negative way, but you get on board others maybe to join on the quality end of production. Also, I feel we're talking about different things here. I mean, this supply chain issue is not about resilience. It is about reliable and measurable standards that are being kept on both ends of the trade line. And values may also come in. I mentioned already the forced labor issue. Still, I feel that the two parties, when cooperating on this, could create some kind of critical mass, which is not possible from the EU end alone. A critical mass on the demand side for particular production ways and routes and standards, and also by selling this to the final consumer, because after all, we are talking about price increases and costs, and about the willingness to pay, or the cleverness in which governments may be able to do the redistribution of impacts, so the incidence. So paying back to citizens what they charge with the CO2 price, selling this to their constituencies, and redoing the logic behind pricing, because the logic at the moment is fossil fuels is cheap, renewable stuff or climate-friendly stuff is expensive. Whether or not that is true is a different piece of cake. So turning this around is part of this agenda. And I think the supply chain issue is about transparency in data. It's about aligning the standards behind it, whether or not you price the product after all, or you set a standard, which is an implicit cost, right? Is secondary to this kind of alignment. I mean, the alignment should be about the common economic agenda that's behind it, and the Green Deal is, after all, an economic agenda here in Europe, at least.
Can I come in? Yeah, can I come in on this? Because I want to start by agreeing with Suzanne in one really important respect, which is that supply chains have become a very crowded area as far as policy initiatives are concerned. And it is important to differentiate between reliability of supply, this is a sort of pandemic related issue, from business conduct, which is a long-standing issue with respect to multinational enterprises, and then the sort of important carbon climate change related aspects. And the fact is, at the moment, the policy is sort of coming in on all three dimensions. And the first thing you have to worry about is first coherence, and whether or not these policies are being designed with any type of systemic view in mind. And the second thing, of course, you notice behind all this policy momentum is that it's the initiatives are primarily national, maybe a little bit regional, but we certainly are not seeing any of this being tackled in multilateral fora in any serious way. So, in that sense, I think the trade agreements lag far behind. Now, perhaps I just said, since the focus of this session is a lot more on climate change, I was surprised in researching for this session that if BCG and others have got their numbers right, there are 8 sectors which have supply chains which are responsible for half of the CO2 emissions. Right? By far the largest is food, then you have construction, then you have fashion, then fast-moving consumer goods, other types of freight and the like. And if what we have here, if 8 sectors really make the big difference, then it does make me wonder whether we should avoid perhaps a more far-reaching attempt to do anything global in Geneva, and perhaps focus much more on sectoral initiatives and maybe it's easier to have dialogue between governments and between the private sector on sector by sector on how they can each make a contribution than looking for some big all-encompassing solution. And that was one of the things I took away from the sort of preparation for this session. So I think again, you start at what the problem is, and if it turns out the problem's concentrated in some pretty important sectors in the world economy, then maybe we should go the sectoral route and pursue it consistently, rather than try and come up with some big overarching global solution.
If I can comment as well, that's a creative idea. I guess I'd like to think about it a little bit more. My sense is that some of the sectors are so interrelated that it may be hard to deal with them separately. I also can't resist the comment that if food is the biggest, I'm not sure we want to start with that because it's also the hardest. I haven't seen many countries willing to talk about what they want to do to their farmers or with their farmers to deal with the climate mitigation. It's a sensitive issue here. Biden was in Wisconsin yesterday where I think this came up, but it's clearly a sensitive issue in Europe as well, which just got finished with its most recent reform to the cap. And I'm not sure whether or not it addressed this or not. On a larger issue, we did an event yesterday called Strategic Autonomy Meets Buy American, which kind of sums up one of the difficulties here.
Yep.
And it featured Peter Harrell from the U.S. NSC and NEC staff, who was the architect really of the executive order that started all this, and his commission counterpart, Kirsten Yorna, from the commission, who is the Director General for Interior Markets, or some long title that I've forgotten. I think they were asked the same question, and both were on a mission to talk about the likelihood and possibility of cooperation transatlantically. They seized on the Trade and Technology Council, newly established as the forum for doing that. Peter suggested, which maybe I wasn't paying attention, but that they're going to set up a lot of different working groups to each tackle different aspects of the issue, and they're going to start meeting, I think, as soon as next week, he suggested. That's all good news. I mean, we'll see what comes out of it. At the end, I think the questions from the audience tended to be, nothing significant is going to happen until the United States stops talking about Buy American and the EU stops talking about strategic autonomy. And both were, I think, very quick to explain that those terms don't mean what you think they mean, and that they're in fact benign. So with respect to supply chain development, I think we'll have to see what the truth is about that.
Just a thought occurs to me. Since we're talking about sort of shared standards for supply chains among fairly like-minded countries, and since we're at the you said, Simon, the WTO may not be the best place to do it, and since I'm just thinking about a recent or maybe a soon-to-be success, let's say at the OECD on tax, would the OECD be a good place to talk about supply chains?
Well, actually, I think, sorry, Simon.
Please go ahead, Susan.
Oh, no, I just wanted to drop that, first of all, sectoral agreements is really an old thing, an old shoe in the climate discussion. And I just to drop one keyword, it is 20 countries that produce aluminum. And we had this debate over and over again. I think it should be raised again. And I thank you, Simon, for bringing this up. It could be a way forward, and at least it's worth a test. OECD, yeah, OECD is really a good idea because on all this, what we are discussing, they have collected a lot of information. And so it needs a trigger to unleash all these information and put them into the context we are discussing right now. So why not? I also feel that a topic we will probably come to next, that some of the OECD members are on the same track as EU and US, and this needs to be sorted out right now. So I wonder how you see this, but I feel it's a good starting point. So
let me build on what Suzanne said, which is, I mean, there are strong advantages from using and deploying the OECD Secretariat. Notice how I was careful in how I said this, because they do have quite a lot of information. And it may be useful in helping to get some of the richer, higher income countries to align on standards. But as we're seeing exactly with the tax issue, once you go beyond the OECD membership, then you have to start bringing them in. And I'm sure all read today's Financial Times, where the concessions which are being made to bring in Eastern European firms, Eastern European countries onto the tax issue basically involves exempting the disciplines for their entire manufacturing sector. So again, one can start at the OECD, but eventually it has to go beyond there. And that's, I think, where the real rubber hits the road.
So looking at some issues that I think you could describe as the rubber hitting the road. One of those is the ideas that are gaining more traction for a climate club and for carbon border adjustment as part of that. One aspect of this debate is, can that be WTO legal? Does the United States need to have a carbon price, which is a kind of equivalent to the EU's emissions trading system? Does you mentioned, Simon, Article 20 of the WTO? I didn't think it sounded completely favorable take on it, but there's some arguments that that's a broad enough kind of provision that it will allow countries to go forward with a CBAM, even if whether or not they have a domestic carbon price. Where do you all see this going? Because the EU says it's going to introduce one in the middle of July. USTR in its trade policy agenda made a reference to the possibility of the US developing its own carbon border adjustment. Is this something that the US and the EU can and should work on together? And are any of you worried about the implications for the multilateral trading system?
And maybe just to get this straight, there's no introduction of a CBAM in July. There's just a legal proposal. And so this is part of a package of, I think, a dozen proposals. And then the legislature comes in. So expect 1 or 2 more years of hot debates before something that is implemented. There was a decision last summer by the heads of state and government that they want to see this as a revenue source starting in 2023. So easy going, easy on the timeline. The US will need a carbon price if it takes WTO rules seriously. Otherwise, they can just maybe use Section 233 again, whatever, to make it work. So there are many things I could elaborate on. I don't know where to start really, because I think as a transatlantic project, to me, it makes most sense to agree that there will be some kind of peace clause, but a kind of mutual recognition of whatever the next step will be, and to keep this really low key, which is difficult because it's undermining so many things that relate to the WTO, even though there are, of course, inroads to make it work along WTO rules. But it's super sensitive. So at the moment, I see rather a strong need to play this a little bit down instead of raising attention more. I don't like it as a club good, to be straight in economic terms.
I think one of the problems on this issue is the debate is not proceeding at the same pace everywhere. The debate in Europe, I think, is significantly ahead of the debate in the United States, which makes it difficult. I mean, I agree with Suzanne that ultimately the United States is going to have to price carbon if we want to get into this game. And I think if the EU proceeds, and I take the point that it's a long process, it's not the next 2 weeks, but I think what we've seen in recent years is that the EU has discovered the delights of first mover advantage when it comes to regulation. And the United States is discovering what those of us that worked on the Hill for years already learned, which is you can't beat something with nothing. And the result is that European regulations become the default because we got nothing to counter it. That may happen here as well, but this is a long discussion. I think if you try to create a transatlantic discussion now about CBAMs, notwithstanding what the administration has said, which I think Peter mentioned, you're right about that. I don't think they're there yet, and I don't think that our politics is there yet. Now, we've had a lot of discussions about this at CSIS. In fact, I'm in the middle of a project on this. We're going to put out a paper on it actually fairly shortly, the first piece of the paper. And I'm one of the optimists in the sense that I think that if Europe goes ahead on its own, I mean, I'm not sure that's good news, but if they do, that may have a transformative effect on American politics. Because if Europe goes ahead, then our companies are going to be subject to it, and they'll complain. And when they complain, they'll come back to the Congress and say, we need to do something to counter what the Europeans are doing. And that creates the framework for a discussion. Although at that point, it may be a little too late because what Europe has done will already be there. But that's kind of the way I see it playing out. Now, my colleagues that are close to the environmental issues are skeptical that that's what will happen. And they think that our political structure is pretty much locked into opposing CBAMs. So I can't be optimistic about the course of events here, but I think in the short run, I'm particularly pessimistic about reaching some kind of accommodation because the United States political debate simply has not proceeded as far as Europe's has.
So let me build on the essentially what we have is the clock ticks faster in Europe, it seems, on this issue than in Washington, and that has, I think, a number of implications. And on the European side, if you believe the estimates necessary for the carbon price to be able to get us down to net zero in any time frame which is needed for the Paris Climate Accords, then the price of carbon in Europe is going to have to rise really, really fast or quite quickly in this decade. That, of course, will have competitiveness implications for European industry, which, of course, then will open the door for two things, not just the border adjustment, but also much more either direct or hidden subsidization of energy-intensive using sectors. And you can begin to see where the trade frictions, not just with the United States, but with other countries come from. So I think that this really is one of these tragedies where if countries are on different timetables in terms of implementing, if the big players are, then we do have a potential for a serious train wreck on this down the road. And of course, any well-meaning person wants to avoid this. But in just reading about what it takes to put in place a system of coherently pricing carbon, governments have to get a lot of things in place and get them done right. And even if they get them done right, then I fear exactly what Bill said, which is they're going to say, look, we've settled this issue. We're not going to reopen it because one of our big trading partners wants to reopen it. So we will get, I think, quite a lot of, first mover, second mover, third movers, whatever, but then trying to bring this all together in a coherent system which doesn't fragment the world economy is going to be a tough order. Or you turn it around and you say, once people see that what's at stake and how much tensions these are creating, then they wake up and realize and rediscover the value of international cooperation. But that's almost like a story which says things have to get a lot worse before they get better.
Well, that, and I think one of the issues that you alluded to is that as this proceeds, there are a whole bunch of very practical questions that come up. And the big two really are measurement and credibility. If you're going to have a CBAM, you have to have a way of measuring embedded carbon, basically. Yeah. But more than that, ultimately, you have to have everybody doing it the same way. Otherwise, you're going to have endless arguments over, the European Union saying, well, Indonesian steel is going to be subject to this border adjustment measure because we've determined that it is this much carbon embedded in it. And the Indonesians are going to say, well, no, that's not right because when we measured it, we came up with a different answer. And then you get into huge problems about that. And then credibility accusations. The Indonesians will, it's all hypothetical, accuse the Europeans of a protectionist approach. And everything sort of spirals downhill. I mean, this cries out for a multilateral negotiation, and it cries out for somebody taking that on. We already have that. The question of who has already been discussed, but I think Simon is right that I'm not sure that we're ready to do that, unfortunately.
let me just, as a last kind of prompt for discussion, before I hand it over to our president, Jeff Rathke, for some final thoughts. Are you, from what I'm hearing, it sounds like you're saying that if the WTO dispute settlement understanding were to be, put back in place, you have a functioning appellate body. Do you think that a member might challenge the United States if it developed its own carbon border adjustment mechanism without a carbon price? And do you think if that member did that, it's likely, would the US would be likely to lose that case? And how, and what kind of effect will that have on efforts to advance climate, measures to fight climate change and on the WTO's legitimacy?
Well, Simon can, I think, speak to the WTO better than I can. My sense is, if that happens, it'll come down to a national treatment issue. Are we treating our guys better or worse than foreigners? And if we can prove that we're treating them the same, which will not be easy, but if we can prove we're treating them the same, then we win.
As far as I can tell from all the debates on the legal ends, it is all about the intention of this tool, and the draft by the EU at the moment is just signaling to other countries that it's mostly securing the competitiveness of the European industry instead of securing anti-leakage effects. And given the intention of this all, a legal case would definitely start going through each clause that is needed to be looked at carefully and in depth. And I wonder how to establish, after all, an appellate body that is established with enough expertise without giving it a bias in one or the other direction. So this would be really a make or break situation, which I wouldn't like to see happening anytime soon, because this is a long way to travel. It's not only about the appellate body, it's about the readiness of the WTO, which is at the moment trying to scale up its competence on all the issues that come up with trade. Please don't forget that over 190 countries are at least ready to submit nationally determined contributions in the climate regime. And I would say more than half of them will have trade implications. And it's not only about the CBAM or anything else. We have trade implications coming up from the climate regime we have put in place. So this won't go away. And of course, a case or a kind of dispute that is being settled will make a big impact on whatever is being scheduled by individual governments on climate protection.
Let me draw one other implication from this, which is that surely one thing we've learned from the WTO dispute settlement body is that when issues are just too sensitive, they can't get solved there. Look at Boeing and Airbus, for example. And so I think there will be forward-looking governments and trade diplomats who will see the importance of trade and climate change, who will not want to have disputes over this issue. And if anything, this will provide another argument for not fixing the appellate body.
With that, let me hand it over to Jeff Rathke, AICGS President. Jeff.
Well, thank you, Peter, for a really great session moderating with Simon Evenett, with Susanna Druga and Bill Reinsch, as well as Jamila Thompson. We've had a sense here and a very clear picture, I think, of the pervasive nature of climate policy on the one hand, but at the same time, uncertainty about what the best forum and the best approach will be. I think this shows us how far we have to go in transatlantic cooperation on climate policy, especially when it comes to the trade dimension, which is crucial for forging an approach that is going to be sustainable and understandable and supported by all parts of our societies. This session brings our Transatlantic Trade Week to a close, and I just want to thank the Konrad Adenauer Foundation for working so well with us, and I think this has been a timely week. If you look at the Biden administration's list of priorities, they often reduce them to 3 C's. COVID, climate, and China. We've covered 2/3 of that this week, and I think we've done that with excellent participation from the European Union side, from the German side, and from Americans and others in Europe, and really enriched the discussion of the challenges ahead of us and the benefits of collaboration to address them. Let me just close by thanking, in addition to Peter and all of our panelists today, Janine Laro from the Adenauer Foundation, Paul Linartz, especially for your leadership at the Adenauer Foundation, and to our colleague Yishang Xu, who has been the producer of our webinar series. So with that, we look forward to remaining in touch with all of you and to seeing you again soon with us. Thanks so much, and a good day to everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.